one of the things I found myself talking about quite a lot recently, partly on the other channel but also here, is to do with motor cognition, broadly speaking. And when I've been thinking about that, I've been talking about Rodolfo Linas, Pat Church and those kind of people, who are basically saying, if I understand them correctly, that cognition is at least partly a function of representations from the sensorimotor system. So we think through the mobilization of representations of experiences that we have in the world, but those representations aren't pictures of the world, kind of inert, passive images of that which is outside us. Rather, they are pictures of our relationships to that world. So my sensorimotor representation of this fence post here isn't kind of transparent. Isn't a how can I explain? It isn't my transparent apprehension of that post as somehow separate from my seeing of it and my experiencing of it. That representation that I have in my mind right now, which is completely real and completely physical, but that representation comes from the visual representation comes from what's happening in my eye and my visual system, and that's a motoric process. It isn't a passive camera-like process. It's saccading of the eyes. It's a whole set of active processes which are finding the shape of that, scanning the shape of that, tracing edges and so on, plus all of the other visual process to do with discounting other kinds of motion in my body, for example, so that the fence post appears stationary, even though as I move about, it's changing its position on my retina. There's all that kind of visual process, and the visual representation that I have of it is a representation of those processes, not of the post. And the same thing in terms of its tactile quality. I'm putting my hand on it, but what I'm feeling is the representation of the representation of the post that I call my feeling of the post is the sensory motor activities in my hand. So as I wrap my hand around the top of this post, it's the shape my hand is making, it's the sense of pressure on my fingertips, it's a slight feeling of roughness under my fingertips, because my fingertips are vibrating slightly, just moving a little bit, and tracing those indentations and those grooves and splinters. And it's that, again, a very motoric response, sensory motor response, that forms my representation of that post. Okay, so far so ordinary. So thinking is internalized movement, as Linas says. When I think that post, even when I don't call it thinking, I call it seeing or perceiving, is also movement. It's sensory motor representations. My understanding of that is that's got a name, and that's called motor cognition. Cognition through motor activity, at least partially through motor activity. And those representations are sometimes called action representations. They're representations not of objects but of actions, my actions in relation to the world, if you like. But I suppose what I'm thinking of is just the scale at which those things happen. Because the example I was just giving just then, well, to a certain extent at least, was about kind of gross motor actions. It's the wrapping of my hand around the top of a fence post, or the movement of my head backwards and forwards, which is subtracted from the visual information so that the fence post appears stationary. That's all quite large actions, but although I haven't done enough reading to support this yet, I would be surprised if it wasn't the case that motor cognition is also based on a level of sensory motor representation which is very, very fine-grained. Possibly, I don't know, maybe very, very fine-grained indeed, actually. I mean, it would certainly have to take into account something like the saccading of the eyes that I just mentioned, which is a very tiny and, of course, non-conscious action. Just a few seconds of arc are moved through when your eyes saccade backwards and forwards, but is absolutely vital to the act of seeing. It would also have to include things like pupil dilation. So part of the motor response that I am having to the light in the world that I'm looking at right now is the pupil dilation that I'm experiencing, which are giving me is kind of factoring in some information about the illumination around me. It would have to include things like, to move away from vision for a minute, it would have to include things like that property skin has, kind of standing on end, you know, when your hair's on your end and your skin stand on end. It would have to include that kind of level of motor response, completely involuntary and largely unconscious, I think, for the most part. It would have to include things like the dilation of capillaries, blood capillaries, which happens in certain kinds of situations. That would be and that's absolutely part of that. It would have to include the opening out of sweat glands. It would have to include things like perhaps certain kinds of biochemical activities. I mean, obviously I can feel it when adrenaline's pumping into my system and all the changes that are happening in that. But some of those changes are very subtle indeed, and I don't really feel them consciously. But a fully fledged theory of motor cognition would have to include those kinds of actions within action representations. And possibly even really, really tiny ones. I don't know what I mean by that exactly. But it would have to include, I don't know what it would have to include. I suppose I'm questioning whether it would have to include things like, no, I can't get it really. It would have to stop at the level of the nerve, I think, given that this is a kind of a function of the central nervous system. Anything that didn't make a direct impact on the nerve couldn't be part of an action representation, I guess. I'll have to find out at what level that operates. You know, maybe there are very, very tiny motor responses which do feature within the representations within the central nervous system, but which are even more finely grained than the ones I've talked about so far.